Good morning. This morning we're going to look at suffering. Suffering both as it applies to Jesus and also as it applies to us. One of the amazing things about our faith in Christ Jesus is the ability that God gives us to look back over time and to see how everything that has happened now is part of His plan. And as we study the Old Testament in light of Jesus coming, we're able to do just that. We're able to see how God had planned to send Jesus. He was preparing the people and He was preparing the rest of the world for that event. And He even gave us detailed pictures of those events long before they came about. And we saw that last week as we looked at Psalm 22, as Jesus as the suffering king. This morning we want to have a look at Jesus as the suffering servant. John Mansfield from Baptist World Aid is actually preaching at Deception Bay Baptist Church this morning, which will be live on Facebook. That's why I thought I would just continue on for the YouTube audience out there. So if you don't know anything about Baptist World Aid, it is a wonderful organisation. Look it up on the internet. It'd be great if people could support it. So let's have a look. We're going to have a look at Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, and we're going to have a look at Isaiah chapters 42 and 52 as well this morning. Now, these two passages are part of what are known as the servant songs in the last half of the book of Isaiah. There are four passages which talk about the servant of the Lord. So if you have those passages, please read them at your own time, at your own leisure. Watch your sermon, write down some notes. So, of course, I guess the first question that bears to mind is, who is that servant? Let's have a look at the identity of the servant. Now, let me talk a little bit about Isaiah. Isaiah was a prophet. And as such, his role was, if I can oversimplify it, so to speak, was he was to speak to the people on behalf of God. Sometimes this was forward-looking, like God will do. But the main concern was to speak to the people about their present circumstances, what was actually happening. One of the amazing things about how God works is that He can speak to His people in their circumstances. That's what I love about God. But also, He can see far ahead and have the words mean something a little bit more significant later on. That's what we see happening, that is happening in the servant songs in Isaiah. If we were to take the time to look at the history, look at the background in depth, we could identify the servant in Isaiah's time. But because we now look back through Jesus and His work on the cross, we see that Isaiah's descriptions, they're most true about Jesus. John 12:41 states it clearly. Isaiah saw Jesus' glory and spoke about Him. This after quoting two specific passages from Isaiah, one of which is our main text for this morning. And there are a number of evidences in these verses themselves but Jesus. If you have a look at Isaiah verse 42 and chapter 42 verse 1, where it says, brings justice to the nations. You jump down to 42:4, establishes justice on earth without faltering. Verse 42:6, chapter 42:6, is a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles. Verse 7, opens eyes that are blind or frees captives. Chapter 52 verse 14 to 15, was humiliated and then exalted. Then we go into chapter 53, verses 5 and 6 and 11 and 12. And the climax could be and did take the punishment for our sin as a substitute for us. The rest of the New Testament also makes it clear that we can look back. We can look back and we see Jesus as a suffering servant in Isaiah 42 and 53. In Acts 8, 26-40, it tells a story of a man from Ethiopia reading the same passages that I want you to go and read. And there he's asking the same question. Who is this prophet? Or who is the prophet? Who is a person the prophet is talking about? And beginning from there, Philip says, told him the good news about Jesus. My Bible study makes the claim that Isaiah 52 verse 13 to chapter 53 verse 12 is quoted more in the New Testament than any other Old Testament text, and those quotes are linked explicitly to Jesus. So enough with the background. What picture of Jesus does this paint for us this morning? And what does it mean for you and I? Those are the questions that I want to look at this morning. Second point I want to make is the role of a servant. We know this is exactly how Jesus lived his life on earth. If you go to Philippians chapter 2 verse 7, it tells us that Jesus made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant. In Matthew chapter 20 verse 28, it's a very direct mention to Isaiah chapters 42 and 53. Jesus says, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for the many. The most famous example of Jesus being servant was Jesus washing the feet of his disciples in the upper room the night that he was betrayed, found in John chapter 13. Isn't that incredible? I want you to think on that, to dwell on that for a moment. Jesus, our Lord and Saviour, our King, he came to serve. He served God the Father first. Of course, we know that. But he served his disciples also. Why do you think that is so? Why is that so? He tells us exactly why in John 13. To be an example for us of how we need to treat one another. We need to be servants also. We need to look at ways to meet others' needs. Not in a flashy, not in noticeable, obvious ways. We need to do that without fanfare and without publicity. And let me tell you from experience, that's exciting ministry. Being able to do that, being able to be a servant without the flash and the fanfare and the trumpet sounding. Let's have a look at the suffering of the servant here. The picture in Isaiah is more than simply that of a servant. However, it's of the servant who suffers. And the picture of suffering here that we find in Isaiah is severe. Now, once again, the description of suffering finds its most complete fulfillment in Jesus suffering on the cross. So let's have a look at Jesus suffered for you, and he suffered for me. Almost always, whenever we confront suffering, the first question that we ask is, why? That's always a hard question. Often one for which there's no good answer. Isaiah 53 is really clear, though, about the why of Jesus' suffering. He did it for us. Let me read Isaiah 53 verse 46. He took up our infirmities and he carried our sorrows. He was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. This is nothing new to us as Christians. Yet we can never allow ourselves to become casual about it. That's the important thing about it. Don't become casual about it. Jesus suffered on the cross for you and for me. He took the punishment. He took the punishment that we deserve, that I deserve. He stood in my place. All of the suffering that Jesus went through, he did for me. He did for you so you and I could be saved. I love to be reminded of this fact, because I need to live my life, my daily life, in the shadow of the cross. I need to weigh up every decision in light of Jesus suffering for me. And I guess when we choose to sin, I think often it's partly because we've forgotten how big a sacrifice it was, how great a sacrifice it was, how great the cost was. Jesus paid to free us from sin. For me, keeping the cross in the forefront, that motivates me. I want to challenge you this morning. The next time you are tempted to sin, I want you to pause. I want you to shut your eyes, and I want you to imagine how Jesus suffered on the cross. Look into his eyes and make the decision. I want to talk a little bit about Jesus suffering silently. Is another little point I want to speak about. Our text also says that Jesus faced suffering. or tells us how Jesus faced suffering. Isaiah chapter 42 verse 2 and 3 reveals Jesus' character in the midst of suffering. It is a picture of meekness. It's a picture of tenderness. Isaiah uses wonderful images, a bruised reed, smouldering candle wick, and claims that the servant would treat these tenderly, gently. It says he wouldn't cry out or basically make a big public fuss. Chapter 53 verse 7 tells us the same thing, that he faced his suffering silently. Is there a model for us out of all of this? Let's talk about our suffering. That's the picture Isaiah paints for us of Jesus, the suffering servant. What does this mean for you and I? Does this picture tell us anything that will enable us to live better? I believe the answer is yes. One of the reasons we long for heaven is that we know there's going to be no more suffering there. No more tears, no more sickness or pain. That's how Revelation describes heaven. But until that time, suffering's part of our world. It's part of our experience. We don't want it, but it is there. I think we sometimes send mixed messages about suffering as Christians. On the one hand, we say we should be like Jesus and just accept it quietly as from God and just patiently endure it. Yet on the other hand, we say that we should be like Jesus and we should fight the suffering around us, healing the sick, freeing the captives, and giving sight back to the blind. So which is it? Which is it to be? I believe the answer to how we respond depends at least in part on why we are suffering. There's another type of suffering, one which I've never known. And that's suffering because of my faith. I don't know that. This is most often the type of suffering that the New Testament writers were talking about. It was a reality for them, like it is for many, many of the persecuted Christians in our world today. This is where others inflict pain. Others inflict pain and suffering simply because we believe that Jesus is the resurrected Son of God and we live in obedience to him. This is righteous suffering. This is what the second half of 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 20 talks about. But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. This is where Jesus' example of how to endure suffering from our text in Isaiah, I guess it's most applicable to us. If we are suffering for doing good, for choosing to follow Jesus, we should do it with the goal of enduring it and trusting ourselves to God, who sees and hears, and he really does deliver. The problem isn't generally when we suffer as a result of our sin. We can we can understand that and we can recognize that. And often in the reports I read of Christians persecuted for their faith, there is a strength that comes with a type of suffering. Even though it is horrid, even though it is horrific, even though it is terrible, even though it's beyond my imagination, there's always, often a corresponding supernatural strength and grace and ability to endure. I think the toughest is either when we don't know why or when the suffering is unjust because it's a result of someone else's sin. I think of people being killed by these teenage drivers on the road. I shouldn't say all teenage drivers, but just these young people who steal cars. For example, or people who are victims, who are innocent and the victims of crimes. It's those times that we cry out, why? What did that happen to that young couple down south a little while ago? And we have the hardest time in responding or knowing how to respond. I don't have an answer to the why question, but I do have a few ideas how to respond. First one is ask God for his presence. I learned this last week from Psalms 22. We first need to see God working in our lives, in the good, and in what we perceive as the bad. We need to ask him to come near and to hear our prayer. Another thing we need to do is ask God for the miracle. This is what God has told us to do. When Jesus encountered suffering, he did something about it. He healed. He set free. He delivered. He did miracles so people would be set free from that suffering. So our response is to go. It's to go to prayer and to ask God to help. We know that God hates suffering. And I think by the simple fact that there is no suffering in heaven. And so we can ask with confidence, knowing that God hurts along with us and often wants things to be different. Third point is accept God's answer. Sometimes we try to jump to this place before we've done the first two, especially number 2. We feel like this is a correct thing to do, the Christian thing to do. But I guess that's wrong. I think it's more Christ-like to fight most types of suffering than to simply accept them. However, let me say a big however here. There comes a time when, for whatever reason, God answers no. The suffering continues, and in these cases, after we go through all the feelings, those feelings that naturally come, we come to a point of acceptance. I know many of you are far more qualified to talk about suffering than I am. You have endured far more suffering than I have. You have fought and struggled, and you've wept and you've yelled. Maybe you still are. But I also know that you would have to say the same thing, that eventually we come to a place of acceptance. The most important part is minister to others out of our suffering. Once you've come through this time of suffering, whatever that is, you've seen the other side, you've reached there. I believe you are powerfully equipped to reach out to others who are going through similar things. I don't want to jump too far ahead and get to this point too soon, but you have a powerful ability to understand what others are feeling when you felt it, and you have felt it. Henry Nouwen wrote a wonderful book called The Wounded Healer, where he shows us exactly how to take the pain we've experienced in the past and use that in reaching out to others. Henry Nouwen, Nouwen, fantastic book. Suffering is one of the main themes in the Bible, and I know I haven't done it justice this morning. I also know that for some of you here today, some of you watching this here today, this is a very real need. There is much suffering to your life. And though there are lots of things that are unclear in your life, there are 2 things I can state with complete confidence this morning, regardless of whatever the cause of that suffering is. And I want to close with these 2 things this morning. The first one is, God knows. He sees. He feels the pain. He hates the suffering even more than you and I hate it. Those nights where you cry yourself to sleep, you don't do it alone. God is right there next to you, holding you. You feel him. Or whether you feel him or not, I want you to reach out to him for strength. Reach out for him for that supernatural strength. And finally, God made us to need each other. Even as the suffering servant Jesus was on the cross, Jesus' mum was there. Some of his close friends were there as well. We need each other. If you are suffering, please reach out. Please talk to somebody. Allow others to come beside you in your suffering. Allow that support, that encouragement for those people to walk alongside of you. Hey, may the Lord bless you. See you next time.